I was on the Circle line in London, late afternoon, the usual smell of damp coats and brake dust hanging in the carriage. We were pulling into Westminster, Big Ben doing its dramatic peek through the window. Across from me was a sunburned Midwestern dad in a fresh baseball cap, clutching a paper tube map like it owed him money. He squinted at the closing doors and finally announced to his wife, loud enough for half the carriage to hear, they should really run this thing 24/7 like in New York. That's the global standard. A couple of locals tried to explain night engineering works, safety, all that boring infrastructure stuff. He just frowned, tapped his watch, and muttered about inconvenience. I figured if the British Empire couldn't convince him London is real, the Transport for London schedule definitely wouldn't. In Rome, near Piazza Navona, I was wedged at a tiny trattoria table that wobbled every time someone walked across the cobblestones. The smell of garlic and actual tomatoes, real ones, not the jarred stuff, drifted out of the kitchen. Next to me sat a guy in a golf polo tucked aggressively into cargo shorts, phone face up with the brightness set to nuclear. He waved the menu at the waiter and said, "So where's the proper Alfredo and the dollar prices? I can't convert all this monopoly money." The waiter did the classic Italian half shrug and patiently explained euros, regional dishes, and that Alfredo is mostly an export myth. The guy went quiet, ordered lasagna, and chewed it like it had personally offended Apple Pay. In Munich, at a beer garden by the Isar, you could smell grilled bratwurst and spilled lager baking slowly in the evening air. I squeezed onto one of those long wooden benches as an older American couple slid in across from me, both wearing matching fleece vests like they were on a team assignment. The husband stacked his empty steins into a proud little tower and finally announced, "I'll just pay later at the bar. That's how it works everywhere." The waiter calmly explained 3 separate times that you pay your server and maybe leave a small tip in cash. No heroic credit card swipe montage. The man looked insulted at the idea of carrying coins like Germany had personally attacked his points program. Paris, late morning, inside Notre Dame before the fire. The air was thick with incense, footsteps echoing off stone. Light spilled through the stained glass in that quiet, colored way that shuts everyone up for a second. Behind me, a woman in a sequined hoodie and enormous sunglasses lifted her tablet, Flash already armed like she was storming a concert, and said, "Why don't they just modernize this place? It looks half finished." An usher, who'd probably seen every variation of this moment twice, gently asked her to turn off the flash and explained restoration, history, 9 centuries of it. She lowered the tablet, full pout deployed, and I realized some people think anything older than their warranty is just broken. In Iceland at the Blue Lagoon, steam rolled over the milky water, and the air smelled faintly like hot rocks and egg salad. The sky couldn't decide if it wanted to be gray or aggressively white. Near the edge, a tall guy with a fresh buzz cut and a sunburn that had no business existing that far north stared out at the lava fields. He turned to his buddy and declared, "If this is basically Alaska, where are all the polar bears and safety fences, man?" The lifeguard, who looked about 19 and emotionally retired, explained the whole no wild polar bears thing, geothermal hazards, and why you don't need a railing every 5 feet. The guy nodded like he'd been robbed of an attraction, then complained that nobody warned him foreign sun could still burn American skin. On a Swiss inner-city train heading into Zurich, the carriage was so quiet you could hear pages turning and the soft hum of the air conditioning. Snow lines still clung to the distant mountains, even though the valley looked like spring. Across the aisle sat a businessman in an ill-fitting navy suit, laptop open, typing like the keyboard owed him rent. When the conductor walked by, the guy yanked out his earbuds and barked, "You should announce stuff in proper English, not whatever that was. The conductor politely explained there were 4 national languages, and announcements rotated between German, French, Italian, and then English. The man shook his head and said Americans wouldn't tolerate that kind of confusion, which was funny, considering nobody had asked. In Amsterdam, on a drizzly Saturday afternoon, the whole city smelled like wet bikes and canal water. I ducked into a very obvious brown cafe, wooden bar, old beer signs, the whole ambiance package. A college-age guy in a hoodie that still had the shop crease sat at the next table, eyes wide like he'd just unlocked Europe in HD. He poked at the menu and asked the server, "So this is the place with the legal stuff, right? Like in the movies?" The server, who looked like she'd heard this exact line since birth, calmly explained the difference between a cafe and a coffee shop, then pointed down the street. The kid went red, ordered a hot chocolate, and I'm pretty sure that was the first time Google Maps ever failed him. Down in Seville, noon heat made the streets shimmer like bad CGI. I leaned in the shade beside a closed storefront, metal shutter down, business hours clearly posted if you bothered to read Spanish. A man in a tucked-in tourist t-shirt, calculator app open, stared at the shutter and announced to his buddy, "If they cared about profit, they wouldn't just shut the whole city for nap time." An old shop owner across the alley chuckled and explained siesta, heat, family lunches, all the things that don't show up in quarterly reports. The tourist shook his head like he'd uncovered the real reason Europe doesn't have his favorite burger chain on every corner. On a blazing afternoon in Athens, the stones around the Acropolis reflected heat back up like a grudge. I'd parked myself in a tiny patch of shade near a column that had seen more history than any of us deserve. A guy in a sleeveless sports jersey and brand new sneakers looked up at the Parthenon, squinted, and told his girlfriend, "They should just rebuild it properly. Imagine the ticket sales if it looked new." A nearby guide, running on caffeine and frayed patience, gave a quick explanation about preservation, authenticity, and not turning everything into a theme park. The guy nodded, then asked where the closest mall was, which felt like the most honest review the ruins had gotten all day. Midsummer in Stockholm, late at night, sky refusing to go fully dark. The air was cool, smelled faintly of pine and boat fuel near the water. I was sitting on a bench near a ferry stop when a retired-looking American couple wandered over in matching windbreakers, both squinting at their watches. The husband looked at the bright horizon and said, "They should really sync the sunset with normal bedtime. This is just bad planning." A nearby teenager, headphones around his neck, explained latitude and the midnight sun thing in pretty solid English. The guy sighed and muttered that back home the Weather Channel would never let something like this happen. In a tiny pub on the west coast of Ireland, the air was a mix of spilled Guinness, turf smoke, and someone's wet dog napping under a stool. I was nursing a pint when a lone American tourist wandered in, jeans still damp from the rain and hair doing that frizzed jet lag thing. He glanced at the locals at the fiddles in the corner and asked, "So when does the band start playing that movie Leprechaun stuff?" The barman let silence do a full lap, then explained the difference between tourist shows and regular lads playing folk tunes for their neighbors. The guy nodded slowly, and I watched him realize the soundtrack doesn't show up just because you bought a ticket. In Salzburg early evening, the old town streets were quiet enough to hear your own footsteps on the cobbles. Church bells rang somewhere in the distance, most windows already dark. I was staying in a little guest house when a middle-aged American in a college football hoodie stormed down to reception, phone in hand, volume set to airport. He showed the owner his screen and said, "You can't tell guests to be silent after 10. People have freedom to relax how they want." The owner, perfectly calm, pointed to the Hausordnung and explained quiet hours, neighbors, city fines. The guests stalked off grumbling that in a proper hotel chain, the neighbors would be the ones who had to adapt. In the Scottish Highlands, my hotel room had drafty windows, creaky floorboards, and the kind of charm you only get when the building predates modern plumbing. I was trying to figure out the heating when a guy from the tour group started swearing through the wall. Later, still red-faced, he told everyone, "These outlets are wrong. The switches must be a safety bug. Someone wired this whole country backwards." The guide explained UK plugs, switches, fuses, all the reasons you're less likely to fry yourself than back home. The guy didn't say much after that, but he left every light on, like he was daring the grid to argue. In Lisbon, late afternoon, I was at a Miradouro watching trams grind up the hill, metal on metal, river breeze cutting through the heat. A cruise ship drop-off had just spilled a crowd of matching hats and lanyards nearby. One fellow, the self-appointed group economist, inspected the cafe bill, eyebrows climbing. He jabbed a finger at the service charge and said, "I'll decide the tip, not some foreign system telling me what generosity looks like." The waiter, clearly on his last reserves of patience, explained service inclusions, wages, and that nobody was forcing him to add extra. The man paid, loudly announced that his home diner did it better, and somehow managed to sound insulted that the euro didn't flinch. First time I went to Australia, I wound up on a tour headed out of Sydney toward the Blue Mountains, the kind of trip where the air gets drier and the radio signal slowly gives up. The bus windows rattled, and eucalyptus drifted in every time the driver cracked his little slider open. One guy in the back, sleeveless shirt and backward cap, stared out at the scrub and said, "If this is all the same country, why don't they just put the cities closer together like we do?" The driver chuckled and explained distances, population, and that you can't rearrange a continent like furniture just because the drive bores you. By the time we hit the lookout, the guy was winded from a 5-minute walk and still convinced the real problem was urban planning.